Ontario Premier Doug Ford is standing by his anti-tariff ad that U.S. President Donald Trump blames for the end of trade talks. Ford calls it the most successful ad in North American history.
It was very successful, and I got to change my figures. We did an analysis. It's 11.4 billion impressions or views around the world, which is pretty staggering.
So last Friday, President Trump called off trade talks over Ontario's ad. Trump said it was fake and that former U.S. President Ronald Reagan, who's featured in the ad, was a big fan of tariffs.
Well, Canada lied. I mean, what they did was terrible. They made up a fake statement by President Reagan. Reagan was a big supporter of tariffs when needed. And we need tariffs for national security. And they totally turned it around because they're getting hurt by tariffs and we're gaining by tariffs. They've used tariffs on us when we had different presidents very successfully. And they've taken a lot of money out of our country. And now we're taking it all back. And so they went out and they made a fake commercial. The Reagan Foundation went crazy when they saw it because it was, the opposite. It was the opposite of what Ronald Reagan liked tariffs, and when necessary, he would use tariffs.
Marcus Witcher is a professor at West Virginia University and author of Getting Right with Reagan. Marcus Witcher, it's good to meet you. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
First of all, we should put to rest that there was any artificial intelligence used in this ad, as the president implied. This is an actual speech given by President Reagan. Do you think it's an accurate reflection of his views?
Yes, I think that the speech overall is, or the ad is overall a wonderful reflection, an accurate reflection of President Reagan's views. Reagan was an ardent free trader. He believed in open markets and believed that American businesses and workers would be better off in a competitive global environment in which there was free and open trade. And so in that sense, I think the ad very much captured, I think eloquently captured, the president's views.
Okay, so it's not fake and it's not a distortion. So what do you make of how current President Trump reacted to this ad?
Yeah, I'm not going to psychoanalyze President Trump. It's difficult to understand how he reacts to things. I mean, this is a president who's been out of office for going on almost 4 decades. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make much sense how he reacted. I think perhaps, as a historian of conservatism, he's a little bit concerned about Ronald Reagan's words being used against him because Americans and conservatives in particular still have a large amount of respect for the 40th president and very much remember the 1980s as a time of economic growth and prosperity, and Reagan as, the quintessential conservative. And so I think to a certain extent, perhaps Trump is a little bit concerned about, this very popular past president's words being used in a way that was very, very effective against his trade arguments.
Right. Now, the ad, one criticism that's been leveled at it is that it left out the fact that former President Reagan did put tariffs on Japan because of unfair trading practice to do with motorcycle parts, I believe is what the issue was. But he says in that speech, while this is true, he says in the speech he's doing it with great reluctance, right, because it goes against his core values. He wasn't using it as a weapon the way the current president seems to be using it.
Yeah, Reagan in that speech, if you go back and you listen to the entire 5-minute radio address, right, Reagan says basically he's loath to use tariffs in this way, but he thinks he needs to do so because the Japanese, in his view, were dumping semiconductors into the United States market in violation of the previous year's trade agreement between Japan and the United States. And so he's making the case here that Japan is acting in an unfair way in violation of the trade agreement, and that the president has the authority under Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act to basically use the executive power on tariffs to try and sort of get Japan to come back and sort of play by the rules, if you will. Okay, so you can see why Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, used this speech and used this argument in the ads. He says Ronald Reagan is a president of, is a hero of his, someone he greatly admires. He is an important figure in Republican political history and in conservative history. Is he an important figure with the current crop of MAGA Republicans? Because this is a very different party and a very different brand of conservatism. Yeah, the Republican Party is very different than it was even, 8 to 12 years ago. And Ronald Reagan's reputation has diminished, especially among the people who are in the White House currently, and a certain sect of the conservative movement that labeled themselves as post-liberals, who are very, very critical of sort of restraints upon the executive, but also sort of very critical up on people like Ronald Reagan, who believed in free markets, free trade, and what they call sort of like what they believe was sort of a libertarian capture of the conservative movement. And so the sort of regime, if you will, that's in power now doesn't I wouldn't call it conservative, and I think that it's fundamentally at odds with the foundation of what made Ronald Reagan such a powerful politician in terms of his views on trade, right? He was very adamantly pro free trade, and his views on immigration, believed that immigration was part of the backbone of what made America great, sort of always being revitalized by new people from abroad.
Yeah, the shining city on the hill vision of America, that it would be a beacon for the world, an example for the world. I mean, so if the party has fundamentally changed, and clearly I don't think this ad was intended to change President Trump's mind or to change the mind of anyone in the White House. Who do you think is the audience for this, and do you think it worked with them? Like, did it have the positive effect? Doug Ford cites the views and the impressions it got, but does that mean it changed any minds and had any influence here?
I think it's a wonderful thing if we can introduce into the sort of debate over tariffs the views of a very conservative president, a very prominent Republican, someone people still admire, right, and show modern day Republican voters who grew up with their parents and perhaps even themselves idolizing Ronald Reagan, that the current administration has taken us in a drastically, drastically different direction. And I think it's important what you pointed out earlier about the fact that while Reagan occasionally did use the sort of powers in Section 301, he tried to do it very targeted. I still think he failed by and large in those endeavors. I think that his efforts actually hurt the American economy and American industry, but he was very targeted in his approach. Donald Trump, in contrast, right, claims massive executive authority over tariffs and wields tariffs as a sledgehammer as opposed to a scalpel.
Yeah, I'm not sure the Congress of the 1980s would have allowed President Reagan to do what President Trump is doing, right? And he make clear in those speeches that this was a tool of last resort for him. So just as a final point, I'm old enough to remember the free trade election in 1988 and the concerns about Canada's border vanishing and our sovereignty disappearing. And it seems almost quaint compared to the concerns we have right now with what's happening. How do you think former President Reagan would view where things are on continental trade and just the tariff as a policy of first resort being employed by the current White House?
Well, I think, to get a sense of how he would have felt, you just need to go back and watch the ad, right? Or better yet, go back and watch the 5-minute radio address from April 1987. Reagan was very clear. He would have been horrified at the idea that the United States was weakening both itself and its allies, especially if we're to believe the Trump administration's claims about the threat of China in a geopolitical context. It seems really asinine, and I would be really surprised if Ronald Reagan wasn't horrified if he were around today to see the ways in which this administration is wielding tariffs that hurt not only ourselves, but our allies and put us in a weaker geopolitical position as opposed to Russia and China.
Yeah, you may be able to make some changes to the trade balance sheet, but the relationship damage, that is going to be tough to repair. Marcus Witcher, author of Getting Right with Reagan, really appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.